For those of you that don't have access to a third-party modeling application, you can model objects in Vue. There's a lot of different tools for this. What we're going to do is use, starting with Metablobs, and create a mushroom object. Metablobs can be made of any of the primitives, with exception to the plane and the alpha plane. The sphere, cylinder, cube, the pyramid, the cone, and the torus can all be used within a Metablob object. So I'm going to add a torus object and switch the local coordinate, switch to the rotation gizmo. We can hold down Shift in order to constrain the axis and just rotate that 90 degrees on the X. And what I'm going to do, because of the way the scale is set up, and it is easier to navigate Vue with a larger object, we're just going to start and create a large object to begin with, and then we can scale it down when we're done. So now we've got one torus, and this is going to be the rim of the cap. What we could do is stack these upward using toruses and then scaling as we go, but that can sometimes take a little too much time to modify. So I'm going to add in a sphere, switch to the scale gizmo, and we can go ahead and scale up the sphere. And then on the z-axis, the up and down axis, scale it down, kind of move that up. And really, depending on the type of mushroom you want to create, you can do this a lot of different ways. So now we're going to need an object for the stalk, and what we're going to do is use a cylinder. So we just scale that into position. And if you need to, switch over to the 4 viewport mode, just so we can access all the views a little bit easier. And anytime you're modeling anything, it's always important to remember that you are working in 3D, and that just because it looks right in one axis or one view, it doesn't necessarily look right in another. Now I might end up changing the way the sphere looks on top. We'll see how far it dips down. What we're going to do is select the torus, the sphere, and the cylinder. And over on the left, we're going to select Create Metablob Object. Now we can see the difference and the way the transition is between the torus and the sphere. And once we get underneath the mushroom, we're going to have a little more curvature going down. So one thing we could do is double-click on the torus and reduce the intensity of the torus within the overall object. Some of the other settings we have, and changing the envelope distance is going to be a global function, and this is going to affect the entire metablob. So no matter which object you change the envelope distance in, it will affect all of them. That is not an independent. However, you can choose to subtract per object, and you can create some really interesting objects that way by subtracting. And we'll just take a look at that just so you can see the subtraction. So we could even essentially model this way by taking the torus object and scaling it down. But we're going to have some problems around the stalk. So I'm going to switch that back to an additive. Copy and paste the torus object. So Control-C and then Control-V. We can move that down. If we double-click on the object, we can adjust the thickness. We can scale it up on the up and down, and then drag it into the metablob. It will not, by default, add it to the Metablob object when you copy and paste. So the only major thing that needs to be changed is the way the bottom and the cylinder and the stalk is going to be curved. Because right now there's going to be very little geometry and it's going to be very torn. First thing I'm going to do is scale down the cylinder a little bit. It doesn't have to be much. And we're just going to need, one thing we could do is just take and copy and paste the same cylinder, scale it down, and move that object down to the bottom. That will effectively work pretty well. If not, if you want something a little more interesting, what you can do is use a sphere object. Since we already have a scale set up, we could right-click, replace by, and fit the object with a sphere. So now we have a sphere. So sometimes you can work with basic shapes to get your layout, and then go ahead and switch the primitives over. Now the preview we're getting, and we're seeing a lot of torn edges on the bottom. Now when we render this as a metablob, none of that's there. But once we bake the object, which we're pretty much going to have to do, that is going to show up. So basically we're looking at the preview as the baked object, or what's going to end up being the baked object. So we just want to modify our primitives until we get to a point where we're not going to see as much tearing. In this case, I think it's caused by how thin the torus is and how much I'm stretching it. So if we thin it out, it starts to look a lot better. But I just want to use this to get a nice little edge or lip around the edge of the mushroom. So the top isn't perfect, but of course you can really do anything you want with the mushroom shape. But I do think that it is curving under a little bit too much. So what I want to do is reduce that sphere size, and you start to see that it can be a little difficult to control without adding extra geometry. So what we can do is just go through and kind of get everything to match up a little bit better. If needed, we can add additional objects, or even change the different types of the object. If we go ahead and just remove the torus completely, we'll be able to see an edge and kind of that missing area. So we do want something that's going to build up a little bit better. So I am going to reposition our sphere. And hopefully we can just step this up a little bit higher. Right now that's a little too flat. And go ahead and copy and paste. Move up the duplicate. Add that into the Metablob. Reselect. And then we can scale that up. So just a lot of tweaking at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and modify this until I get it to a point where it's going to work out. So I ended up just adding a duplicate of the torus object and thinning it out a little bit. And that did round off the top pretty well. Now the stalk still isn't quite long enough. So I'm going to go ahead and scale the stalk, making sure we don't punch too far through the top. And then we're just intersecting on the inside of the cap go back and take our cylinder duplicate on the bottom, which we converted to a sphere, and move that down. And I'll go back and just reduce the scale of the cylinder just a little bit. So there we go. There is a little bit of an edge showing up. So I can kind of fine-tune that if needed, maybe adjust the influence to get rid of it. But the baked version should be smooth enough, and that shouldn't really show all that much. So before I go ahead and bake the object, I am going to save the scene, just so we can come back to previous version before baking, since the amount of undos I have set up is a little lower right now. And that way we can always come back and remodify it in case something goes wrong a little bit later. That was unexpected. And the reason I'm making the bottom so large, I just want to mention, is because I do want to use this for ecosystem, and that's just going to be the area that's somewhat underground. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out. And I do want to mention that you can change the individual objects within the Metablob to have independent materials, but that can cause some tearing between the polygons, or not even so much tearing, just bad maps. Unfortunately, the object that we get when we bake is not going to be all that high res, and it's basically what we're seeing right now. And since we're not really going to see much of the underneath of the mushroom, and I think with the material we're going to end up designing, what we can do is just keep one unified material. So we'll select the Metablob, and we're just going to call this material mushroom. And now we're going to right-click, go to Baked Polygons, and I'm going to crank it up to the highest setting, click OK. Which really isn't that many polygons. So now if we take a look at a render, it's definitely not as high res as it was before, but overall it doesn't look too bad. This is really more for set up more for an ecosystem. If we wanted to have a close-up, then we would go back to the scene with just the Metablob before baking and use that object for a close-up. So one thing we need to do is take the pivot point, so going up to the top to the numeric tab and moving the pivot position downward into that area where we created that sphere. And that's the area that's going to touch the ground or the surface that is going to have the ecosystem on it. So let's go ahead and edit the material. We're going to start with the color under the Color and Alpha tab in the Advanced Material Editor. And I already have a color map set up for this. I'll go ahead and include it, but because of the compatibility changes since version 8.4, you may not be able to load the color. So I'll go ahead and show you. It's just two different points. The first point, RGB values 73, 70, 64. And then on the left, all the way to the left, we have an RGB value of 132, 134, 124. With our upper and lower mode set to clamp. So what I'm going to do is control the majority of this with the diffusion and connect that to slope. So we're going to right-click, add an output, which is going to be the diffuse. connect that to the slope. And we're going to reverse and do an opposite function of what is showing up for the slope, because I actually want it to be darker on the top and lighter on the sides. So add a filter, set it to opposite. Right now it's going to create a very dark surface because the range is quite large. So what we want to do is limit how dark that's going to get. We can add a filter, set it to map, and we're going to be controlling a percentage between -1 and 1. So the normal values that we have set are 60%. So we can use a value of around 0.4, 0.3 as our upper. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 0.4, and then the lower value, which is going to be the minimum percent, I'll set that to -0.45. And then we can go ahead and take a look. And that doesn't look too bad. I'm also going to connect the color map to the slope. And what's going to control the color. And actually, I do want to bring that to the opposite filter. And what we're going to do for both of these is set up some different offsets. So we're going to select the link, add in a filter, set it to offset. And we can open the output observer to see what we're working on a little bit better. So now we can offset the surface and where exactly the diffusion starts and ends. And then do the same thing, selecting the link to the color, adding that offset filter. And it looks like the range we have is maybe set a little bit too high. Maybe we'll go and just connect that directly to the slope. And if we need to, we can reverse the color map. So we'll go to the color map, edit it, and in 8.5 we can just flip the two colors. Otherwise, you'll need to move them around manually, maybe even copying the colors to reposition them. Okay, so it's starting to look a little bit better. We're going to do an offset of around -1 for that color. So now we also want to set up a little bit of a bump, and we're going to add just a noise node, set it to Berlin noise gradient. Take the wavelength on the Z, and we're going to crank that up to about 20, as that's going to really stretch it out. And then I'm going to set the X and Y to 0.1. And we don't want to use either the object parametric or the main mapping mode, because I do want to control the color a little bit more with another type of fractal. So we're going to add in the position options and set this to object spherical. So now we're going to have some nice lines running around the cap. Connect that to our bump, and we will need to reduce the bump output quite a bit. Go ahead and click OK, and I'm just going to show you right now what it's going to look like, which is going to be very intense and also not quite large enough. So we're going to go back, increase that scale, and maybe we will have to use cylindrical mode. Go back and reduce the scale. Maybe increase the Z up to 50. And I do think that we will need the spherical mode in order to really get this to work. I'm going to change the mapping to object standard and see if that corrects it. So it looks like maybe it's just because of the scale of the objects. Let's go ahead now and scale this down to the more realistic scale. We can drop the object onto the ground using the drop object command. And there we're getting something a little bit closer to what we want to end up with. And the pivot just did get moved, so I'm going to go back to the 4 viewport mode, modify that, go to the numeric tab, and turn off the show pivot. Okay, so we don't want those very large lines showing up all over the cap. Just on specific areas, mainly around the sides. What we have right now would really be best for the fins, which would be the underneath area of the mushroom. So what we can do is use that slope filter once again in order to kind of clamp that out. And I'm just going to double check the cylindrical mode, and it looks like the cylindrical mode is going to work a little bit better for this. So we're going to blend using a combiner node set to blender with just a constant number of 1. Connect that to slope. Turn on the clip ratio, and then we're just going to need to adjust the offset and maybe the intensity. So we'll change the filter to offset. We can move this down just to get it to a point where we want it. And I really just kind of want it showing on the edges. I will still need to really modify and severely modify the setup for the bump function, just because it is really intense. So we're going to change the depth to 0.001 and take a look at that. It might be a little too low. So let's go ahead and use 0.01. And now it's just faintly showing, so we'll bring it to 0.04, and that should be a little bit better. So just a nice subtle little hint of it. So now we're going to go over back into the color in alpha, and we're going to take this connection that's currently controlling the color map, set up a blender, and add in a fractal node. I like for this the round samples 2D. Connect the blender to the altitude, and we can just multiply these values. And maybe go back and swap the color map. It looks like I do have an additional color that got left over, so I'm going to delete that. One problem when you're swapping is the points do tend to get hidden on the edges, and that's where that line was coming in before, really causing the look of the surface to be a little weird. So it's starting to get a little bit better. We'll go ahead and reduce the scale of the fractal. Increase the gain a little. Maybe swap that back. And I think we're going to stick with that. So now we can go over to the highlights, and I'm going to set this to more of a dull surface. Take the ambient light and turn it up to about 50. And I think I will bump up the offset on the fin bump where it's showing, or actually turn it down just so that those lines are showing up a little bit higher, and that looks a little better. Okay, so now this is pretty much done. And what we can do is right-click and save the object in order to save out as a VOB file. So I'm going to call this mushroom blob. And since I already have one in there, I'm going to call it blob _01. Click OK. And now if we want to add in and take a look at the ecosystem with this object, I'm going to add in terrain and add one of my dirt materials. Double click to open up the material and add an ecosystem. We can then add object, and we can browse the folder that we saved it in. You can add a new collection to locate that folder on your hard drive. I do need to modify the scale and the density. One thing I like to do for mushrooms is turn down the proportion to more of a non-uniform, and then increase the Z scale, or the up and down scale, and then take the X and Y and reduce those quite a bit. We do need to make sure that we populate. And we'll go ahead and take a look. So I think overall that doesn't look too bad. Those will definitely work well for an ecosystem. What we can do is change the material variation a little bit more. If we go into that mushroom material, instead of using the object standard mapping mode, we can use the world standard. We will need to adjust the fractal and the round samples fractal in order to be more of a world scale, and for the variations to show, because the overall scale and coordinate systems will differ. But that way we get more variation throughout the mushrooms as they're being populated, so they're not all identical. But the diffuse slope works really well on mushroom caps, having it on top a lot darker and then get lighter on the edges. That way you don't have to use subsurface scattering, and it's just an overall nice distribution of light. So I'm going to go ahead and save out this version of the scene. And now I'm going to create a new scene and just show you real quick another way to model the mushroom. What I want to do is add in a sphere, and we can copy and paste, add another sphere, scale it, reduce the height a little, and this time I'm going to go ahead and change our materials because we're going to end up with a fairly sharp edge. So we're going to call this bottom one fins, make it a little bit darker, and then the top sphere we're going to rename the material to cap. And now we're going to set up a Boolean object. So select the cap first, then the fin object, go over to the left, and we can use a Boolean Difference, and that's going to subtract one object from the other and cut it out. So this is another way that can be useful for just piecing the objects together as separate objects. So in this case, what I would do is either create a Metablob object for the stalk, or just use a cylinder if we don't want anything, or we don't really need anything special for it. So I'll just go ahead and do that. If you want, you can create a Metablob just as you did before to create a separate object. This doesn't need to be entirely within the Boolean. So go ahead and scale up the cylinder, just our stalk. Give it a new surface, name it stalk, change the color, and I'm just right-clicking to access all of these menus. And I did hit the X by accident because they still have not moved the X away from the OK. I do tend to work a little quickly. So I hit the X a lot and cancel a lot of things out, which sucks. So you can get used to using the Enter key on the keyboard in order to close out your panels. That does sometimes help. So now what we can do with these objects, we can right-click, Vacant Polygons, and we'll probably get a higher resolution object while baking these subtractions as opposed to the Metablobs, and just this cap part of the object is already double the amount of polygons. So bake it kind of a lower amount, take the cylinder, and really the cylinder, since I'm not changing it, I don't have to do anything else with. We'll just keep it the way it is as a view object, unless you're going to be exporting. But select both of the objects, group them together, and then take the pivot of the object, move that down to the bottom, and then we can assign our materials. So that's another way to create an object just for an ecosystem. Now another thing we can do with Metablobs, just going back, is add in the cone object. And we can also do the same thing here, where we create two different Metablob objects, and then we can just group them together. If you want to join the group, you can right-click and bake it to polygons, which will connect everything. So that will create one uniform object if that's what you're looking for. But what I'm going to do is take this cone, copy and paste, adjust the scale, move it down, and then select both of the objects, create a Metablob, take the lower cone and the inside cone, so cone 2, double-click, and set it to subtractive. So this creates a pretty nice mushroom cap. And then we can just adjust the shape in order to really get what we're looking for. So that actually looks better than the setup I had before. It's a much taller looking mushroom. And then what we would do is bake this to polygons. So select the Metablob, right-click, bake to polygons, set it to a higher mesh value. This one ended up being, I think, a higher resolution than the other object. Double-click and take a look and see that we do have 20,000 polygons, which I don't think we need that many. View handles polygons very well, but even still. And this type of subtraction and Metablob would probably work a lot better too with assigning different materials to each object, because we do have a really, really fine line around the bottom of the mesh. So I'm just going to rotate this so we can take a look. So since it is going to be jagged anyway, we could very easily customize that. If we want, we can just go ahead and reset that rotation. So now we could, once again, either create a Metablob for the stock, or just add in a very simple cylinder object. Take the Metablob, move it up, making sure that that cylinder is going to be within the top piece of the cap. So we're going to switch to the wireframe mode, and we can see the inside now. So it will be in the cap, and we just fine-tune the scale of the cylinder, and then take the two objects after surfacing them, renaming the materials or assigning new materials to them, and grouping the objects together, changing the pivot. So a lot of different ways we can model these objects, and it would be very easy just to take the material that we used on the other mushroom and assign it to this one. So it's a nice little way to extend the amount of objects you can populate ecosystems with or make your scenes with if you don't have access to another modeling package or you're not familiar with other packages. Blender is free, which is actually a really good modeling package. It's got a lot of good tools in it. So you can check that out, blender.org, if you want to learn to model traditionally.